Good evening. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Sorry, I'm so used to saying good evening. Today I'm just updating some of the details because Restream did not update my Twitch game, so it seemed to say I'm still playing Final Fantasy. Anyway, this is a morning session. I'm going to be talking shortly with Eric Harper, who's the person I work with on the Freudian Spaceship project. So the idea is we have a chat every Friday morning usually as part of the project, and I thought we'd try streaming some of them and see how we're going. So that was the idea. I'm literally just checking a couple of bits to make sure everything's kind of working, and then where are we? We're just checking this and just checking this. Yes, that all seems to be working. Okay, anyway, here's Eric. Hello, Eric. Let me just move this around because I'm looking the wrong way. There we go. I prefer it if I'm looking the right way. How are you, mate?
I'm fine, Matt. I'm going to need to go at about 5:02 because I've got a meeting with my colleague from the university to plan the curriculum at 5:02.
That sounds so. Just a brief chat today. A brief chat. 5 to 11. Yeah, in about half an hour. Yeah. That sounds cool. So you've read that Agamben thing that you sent me, haven't you?
I've read it. I'm a very slow reader, Matt. I've read about over half of it, 2/3 of it. It's a bit repetitive, but I think there's some real gems in it. I mean, you're obviously skeptical.
Yeah,
I can see by your face.
I am skeptical. Well, I mean, there's a couple of moments in it. I read it last night. I sat down and read through it last night.
You read the whole thing?
Yeah. It's not
Jesus,
long.
Matt, how quickly do you read?
It took me about maybe 3.5 hours.
Jeez.
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. Three, maybe 3-4 hours, something like that. It wasn't ridiculously long.
Okay.
But and obviously Agamben had that whole issue. You can kind of tell it's there at the start when that little piece, I think it's the third or the fourth one, isn't it? It says, it was commissioned and then refused. And Agamben got himself into a lot of trouble, didn't he, at the start of the COVID crisis because of saying so-called epidemic and all this kind of stuff. I would like to talk about it some more. I think there's a real I think basically there's a lot that's terribly wrong with what Agamben is saying, and a kind of, I mean, the thought I had when I was going through it is like he's speaking from behind this veil of liberalism in which the world that he's kind of decrying the loss of doesn't actually exist, and so this is kind of the veil of liberalism. We have the numerous times he talks about the separation of rights between executive and legislative, and in democracies, and he talks about the loss of democracy and all these kind of things, and this is what I would say call the veil of liberalism. There's no such bloody thing for working class struggle and stuff. It's always contingent upon whether you want to
record this, Matt, for your talks or not.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. It's going out. Okay. We are recording it. So there's a lot of that, and there's a lot of that I disagree with, but there's something that's niggling away at the back of my mind.
Well, just before you say that, can I just come in?
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. I think the critique it does speak to a particular taken for granted privileged viewpoint. And it's very Western in a way, and it speaks to a very Western perspective. And the assumptions he's making don't cross borders in terms of the experience of other cultures or the experiences of even in Europe of the working class. So I think that's absolutely correct. And it can be it's problematic in that regard, but at the same time, I do think that there's some gems in what he's saying, and I also think it's very interesting that there's a rise of certain kinds of discourses that are happening in the world at the moment. The conspiracy theory, the anti-vaccine people, the people who question things, and Agamben was at one point the darling of the left. And if you
Well,
wanted to
to an
speak
extent,
about certain issues, you needed to quote Agamben. So he's suddenly fallen from grace, which is very interesting. And in a sense, do we somehow just totally discredit things which are not part of the armchair rhetoric, so to speak? You know, there's a certain, it seems to be almost, I don't quite know if it's a battle for certain accepted positions. And I think the areas are gray.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are definitely some kind of odd areas at the moment. I think Agamben is plainly, someone who's capable of thinking well, and so even when I encounter this and think there's something missing here, even when I encounter it and think that, I'm still kind of thinking, well, actually, that is an important symptom. There's a kind of important symptomatic like moment here when a philosopher who generally speaking I understand to think well, is thinking in such a way that makes me feel disjointed from them, or like somehow out of sync. And it's like, right, okay, so I feel out of sync with what you're saying here. It feels a bit weird. However, I know that you can think well. So now I'm faced with a situation of like, well, what's going on here? Why are we out of sync? How has this happened? Part of it may be generational, part of it may be just absolutely contingent fact. But there is something there was a kind of plea in it. That was one of the things that was interesting, is there was this kind of desperation in the voice, and there's a kind of repetition at points that's very interesting, because one of the things that it showed is that what he was saying was almost scripted, like a political speech. He was. I mean, this wasn't off the cuff stuff. This was stuff that he'd formulated and was. I mean, I think I've made a couple of notes, and we can talk about this maybe some more next week if you like. But there's a point at which it's very clear that he writes something, and then he has an interview. I think it's with someone in Sweden or something,
and he repeats the exact same points.
Right, and he uses exactly the same words, and it's like, right, plainly you've written this, scripted it, and you're using this quite reasonably as a kind of like, I want to be careful. I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I want to have it kind of written. I don't want to just get caught off the cuff. So there's a clearly kind of engaged strategic thought here. Someone who's
I think it's very interesting what you're saying. And can I share how I responded to the reading?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
I had two responses in terms of the tone of the voice. In terms of the repetition, I thought this is what happens when thinkers get old. That happens to Deleuze. It happens to a lot of people. Yes. No, but seriously, they simply repeat the same things, because I think there isn't the same diversity of neurons and things. So they just kind of follow the same pathways. So people just kind of repeat stuff. But the second response I had was the opposite of yours, actually. I thought, what happens when there's a crisis is thinking changes and emotions change. And in most cases, people stop thinking. Thinking becomes black and white. It's very right and wrong. There's very little ability to engage with complexity and to think when there's a crisis. And I thought, here is somebody who was at the height of the crisis. He's writing at the height of the crisis in Europe, and he's holding an alternative position, and he's still somehow endeavoring to think at the height of the crisis, as well as lay down an ethical position, because he's confronted. Well, how do you feel about your own death? He says, well, one must always be prepared for death. So he's somehow, I agree with you, he's making a political statement again and again, and I agree with you, there's a plea, there's a crying out. But I do think he goes against the mainstream, and he gets a lot of flack from his own community, and to some extent, he gets excommunicated, I would argue. There's probably been a lot of people who snigger about him now. But he's thinking. He's thinking, and he's saying, for me, he's saying some things which are absolutely correct. As well as, of course, there's some problematic things in terms of what he's saying, and Eurocentric and liberal, etc.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, okay, so that, yeah, I mean, I agree, and I did, and it was interesting encountering the text for that reason, because it was plainly not a text within the philosophical community. This is plainly a text that's deeply engaged with the world around it in a kind of, as I say, strategic political way. But there's thought at the heart of this, and as I say, that being out of sync with what he's saying, not feeling in sympathy with it, actually made me feel like, well, there is an issue here, because I respect this person as a thinker, and there's this person I know to think well. There was another point that I thought was kind of, I noticed towards the end. Last time we talked about this, you talked about these three religions that he mentions: capitalism, Christianity, and science, and this notion of these three different religions. And you were talking about them as somehow connected to Freud as well. So, but we can get back to that. But one of the things I noticed, and this did actually make me. This was interesting, is he begins by talking about the science of, or the religion of science, and by the end of the book, now bearing in mind this is all quite short stuff, but by the end of the book it seems to be fairly clear that this is now the religion of medicine, and a particular kind of science. Now that's a very, very interesting moment, actually, because if you go all the way back to Kant's critique of pure reason, the relationship between medicine and science is quite interesting and quite distinct, because the notion of science, as it were, articulated on the frame of physics, on frame of Newton, let's say, and the frame of mathematics, is quite distinct from a notion of science that's connected to medicine, which is always much more closely connected to art, to healing, to social political events. And there's something radically distinct between these two things. And obviously biology in its contemporary form, particularly genetic biology and post-genetic biology, or genetic or biology post the genetic discovery, biology obviously is this kind of weird thing in the middle. Biology wasn't there when medicine started, in the way in which we think about it. Physiology would have been, and anatomy would have been, but what we think of as biology now wouldn't have been, and biopolitics wouldn't have been. So there's something quite interesting about this shift that he makes from science as a religion to medicine as a religion, because I think that actually makes a lot more sense.
You see, because for me at that moment,
I think that needs to be disentangled from science as well,
Because what I think is happening at that moment, I think there's a moment in the 1800s, and Foucault writes, and Foucault's covering this ground. He could be maybe more explicit, but I think there's in a similar and different way that the anthropologist and the Bible played in colonization. In terms of that, you go and you impose a certain discourse at the same time as holding a gun. So they say when the colonizer went to Europe, he had the gun in the one hand and the Bible in the other hand, and he had the missionary behind, and the missionary and the anthropologist as well.
Yeah.
So it's a whole. But I think in terms of the rise of the nation state in Europe, medicine, I'm wondering, what I'm trying to wonder is, could the nation state have developed as it has, or could it even have developed? And probably the answer is yes, without the role of medicine becoming used as a way of the guarantee for the populace that there will be a longer life for those who somehow are part of this nation state, who somehow are part of a certain class. There's a shift in the role of medicine.
Yeah.
The rise of nation states. And maybe the analogy doesn't quite work in terms of colonization, but I'm saying that it plays a very interesting role. And I think, and so what I'm saying is, I think that there's a resurfacing of that moment of crisis, and that's why the governments needed to use this opportunity to reassert a certain authority, because as with the other plagues where it put into question the authority of the church, suddenly the authority of the way that the nation state is structured in terms of the social bonds, the way people identify, the way people hand over a certain authority with the hope that the state will take care of them, offer them a longer life, look after them, protect them from diseases out there, which is always out there in another part of the world, somehow maintain the purity of the body, the rise of the body. I think there's something going on there.
Yes, okay, I agree. I think that. I mean, I think I'm also interested there when you talk about this kind of this historical moment of transition into the nation state. I'm also kind of thinking this is also a historical transition into a different kind of demographic, so into the urban space. Yeah, and so there's two elements to this that come to mind. One is the stuff around the early forms of immunization and Pascal and all this kind of stuff that what's his Bruno Latour looks at a little bit in one of his books on the guy who does the milk stuff, pasteurization, Louis Pasteur. So he looks at like the kind of relationship to this because a lot of that's to do with density of population, transmission, contagion amongst populations that have shifted from one particular situation to another. And similarly, actually, there's a similar thing with H.G. Wells, if I remember rightly, in Britain, where they like the birth of the public toilet, the public convenience in Britain. It's again to do with this kind of like it was one set of habits coming from one kind of from like rural and peasant community, if you like, crudely, but into the town, and they don't fit, and there's all cholera and all sorts of other things that are kicking around. So there's all sorts of issues that arise as the way in which people live changes and the way in which contagion vectors shift, particularly during urbanization and the movement into urbanization. One of the things that's noticeable over the last, I think it's over the last 20, 30 years, is we've just reached a tipping point. So at some point in the last 20 or 30 years, when more than 50% of the world's population now live inside cities. And so that kind of process of urbanization has actually been continuing in the same way that other things have. So there's that element that makes me think, yeah, maybe this particular kind of medicine has a deep connection to the relationship to urbanization and different kind of vectors of contagion. But also at the same time, there's that sense, and this is coming from the kind of sorcery and magic background, that kind of cunning relationship to healing was also taken over and taken away from during the 1800s. That's also shifted and moved. So that's part of, like you'll say, that kind of colonial mentality. That's part of an ideological shift, if you like, or a kind of intellectual shift. So there's those kind of elements, and yes, that does seem to be. This is kind of what's maybe interesting in the Agamben. You see, I think this is where there may be something that I think he may have got the end, the wrong end of the stick in some ways, but the stick itself might still be kind of interesting, which is that he might be right that there is a big shift taking place at this moment, and that this is a kind of moment, a tipping point moment in that shift, and I get the sense that he's on to something there. His way of expressing it and his way of dealing with it, I think, is caught in all sorts of problematics. But the fact that there's something going on at this point, yeah, actually, I think that does. I mean, I'm not sure anyone could really deny that. And what's kind of curious is and this is interesting, is what's kind of curious is how such a radical event has become normalized so quickly, and we're now no longer thinking about it. We're now no longer thinking about quite how drastic that moment in March was, how catastrophic it felt, how, and when I mean catastrophic in the sense of a turning point, catastrophe is that major turning point, how drastic those actions were. And now it just, people are just, oh yeah, we're going back to normal and stuff, and it's kind of amusing to watch him talk about social distancing as the new word, because that's kind of dropped off, and it sort of shows how wrong maybe Agamben is and things like this. But it's like, but he is actually aware of the fact that this is a really serious moment, and the fact that people seem to have like wanting to push this aside, that's actually more disturbing than Agamben by far. That's far more disturbing that people want to stop thinking about what's happening at the moment.
But don't you think that he's given social distancing, he's politicized it and he keeps on repeating the word? And for me, there's a globalization and a normalization of international apartheid, and the apartheid within people's homes, where there's a suspicion of the person that you sleep next to, or everyone's suspicious of everyone in terms of they could be a site of contagion. And it's kind of it's imposing a inward looking a normalization. So people, in a sense, are it's at a simple level. People started looking inwards. People were not gathering on the streets in protest. Well, that did happen, and that was a direct reaction. And it's very.
That's very noticeable about how wrong he is, though. You see, because how drastically mistaken in some sense he is, because obviously the whole uprising in America takes place, the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK takes place. The uprising in America is possibly the most important uprising since the 1960s, and it's almost certainly, as Angela Davis says, almost certainly impossible without the COVID crisis. In a sense, the two, that crisis, I mean, Angela Davis was very clear about this in that sense. It's kind of, the crisis, in a sense, produced the opportunity for that kind of uprising, not just through things like mutual aid and other kind of elements and structures, that were coming about. And again, because, and Agamben's got no sense of this. It's not on his horizon at all. And that's very noticeable. It's very, very noticeable that all he can see is those in power. He cannot see working class resistance. He cannot see the class itself in movement. He can only see the governments and the ruling class kind of discourse. And I think this is part of the veil of liberalism, is they only think that matters. That's the only thing that they ever talk about, because that's the only thing that ever matters to them. They never give a shit about what's actually happening with the working class and with people on the ground, and they don't really care about that. And so that's where I think his social distancing thing is kind of interesting. But I mean, I would say, there's something interesting there, but there's analogies to Reds under the bed. That kind of phrase of Reds under the bed. You must have had something similar in South Africa, the fucking anti-communist kind of mythology, the McCarthyism that was going through. All of this was a kind of contagion of ideas and a kind of, checking of people next to you, except it was much more directed politically. And I think in the case of social distancing, I think that kind of war within that he's talking about and that kind of thing, I think it's almost a side effect. It's almost a kind of epiphenomenal effect of something else. I don't think, unlike Reds under the bed, McCarthyism and the anti-communist movement, I don't think it's directly the thing itself, if you like. I think it's a kind of side effect, and it could have catastrophic effects. It could have important effects, but I don't think, I don't think it's anything other than a kind of a strange contingent anomaly that's arisen. Whereas, as I say, McCarthyism was this was the thing itself. You have to check on people's, and that had arisen from totalitarianism generally, from Nazism and Stalinism generally, where that kind of checking on your neighbor, checking on the thought of your neighbor, checking on the behavior of your neighbor. The Stasi in East Germany, for example, this was part of a totalitarian mindset. So that's, I'm not sure that the social distancing is close to or connected to or has the same kind of implications as a totalitarian mindset, which was a war within, far more than social distancing is. But there is something curious there. And as I say, I think that it's mainly to do with the fact that we're just not thinking at the moment about what's been going on. And it seems to, and that Agamben is at least desperately trying to think about it. And that's important, and to be pursued.
And the point he does make is, well, I think, which is very clear, and is one is the reign of terror, because the whole COVID, it was expressed like a Hollywood horror movie. There was so much generation of terror and reporting in a particular kind of way. And he makes the point, which a lot of people make, like Naomi, what's her name? No, not
Naomi Klein.
Not Melanie Klein. Naomi Campbell, Klein. The one who talks about you terrorize states. You terrorize people. You create a culture of fear.
Yeah.
And that you generate fear. So we definitely see that. And the other is that it is opening sentence. It has been used as a pretext, because for more authoritarian rule. And for me, I really do believe that there is we're seeing an acceleration of this sort of patriarchal, macho, vulgar rule globally. We see it, and And I think COVID has given people an excuse to really, I mean, in France, the stuff that's happening in France is absolutely outrageous. And I don't know what's happening in other European countries. And so many laws are getting passed in terms of the UK around immigration and things like that, and the right for people to protest. So globally, we are seeing a rise of authoritarianism.
Yeah, I mean, this I think is, this I think is what, is where Agamben's pointing to something interesting. This has been a moment in which other things are taking place, and it's not, and it's not a matter of being delusional to say actually people are manipulating this situation. That is shit going on. Is, that people are making, that people are using this as a pretext for, and I think, there's an enormous complication here, because I think there's also quite a big distinction between what appears to me to be the European experience and what appears to be the UK experience, and probably what the US experience is, and then again the African experience, and even across Africa there's going to be diversity between the north, the east, the south. The kind of range of experiences. The South African experience, for example, is not going to be very close to to the Nigerian experience, I think. And so,
well, the biggest experience, the one that's probably the one that really needs to be thought about the most, is the Brazilian experience. Why do people get so excited and panicked, and with good reason, about India? With very good reason, because in India, for the first time, the middle classes don't have access to oxygen, whereas in India, the lack of access to oxygen in the hospitals is something that the working class have been dying from for a long, long time, particularly around childbirth. So it's the norm for the working class in India. The panic was suddenly for the middle classes, there was a lack of oxygen in private hospitals. But anyway, there's this focus on India, which I find very interesting. And yet, I looked at the stats from the beginning. Nobody wants to talk about what happened in Brazil. Brazil somehow has been written off the map of COVID discussion.
Yes, I mean, I think that is one of the difficulties. Is that there's a diversity of experiences here. I mean, people used to talk about all being in the same boat, and it's like, no, we're not all in the same storm, maybe, but we're all in very different boats. And that's kind of important to realize. But I think, and I get a sense that. I mean, we are by far not over and finished with this particular situation, and that's now what's kind of interesting. Is now this situation becomes sort of normalized, and we don't think about it, and we kind of assume it. Now the situation is actually ripe for opportunity. Let's say, if you're a good capitalist, it's ripe for opportunity. We can make some money here. And
the amount of corruption that's happened, the amount of business deals, and I mean that is just outrageous. And I mean, both the Minister of Health in South Africa and in the UK are doing business deals at the height of the bloody pandemic, in the dark, making money. What kind of ethic is that?
Well, I mean,
they get away with it. They get away with it.
That is the ethic of capitalism. There is nothing.
They get away
wrong
with it. They get away with it.
They get away with it. And I think this. I think this is almost, when I talk about the veil of liberalism, this almost, and you talk about the kind of harsh, brutal, patriarchal, macho way that authority is being used at the moment. I think it might be that this actually is more interesting to me at the moment, in a sense. People don't need to pretend to be brutal capitalists anymore. They can basically go, fuck you, you can't do anything about it.
Exactly.
I think, that sense of disempowerment and that sense of removal of power. I think one of the things we encountered very powerfully in the COVID crisis, particularly at the start, was this disempowerment and this sense of we have no capacity to do anything. And I think that actually, psychologically, intellectually, ideologically, I'm not really sure, but there's a kind of sense of that makes me more worried, concerned than anything else. And of course, the resistance to that was precisely the insurgency in America, the insurrection, that took place in America. in the Black Lives Matter struggle. And I think that, so there's different elements to this story. You're going to have to go. It's 5-2.
Yeah, I have to go. All right, Matt. We'll continue next week.
Yes, let's continue this chat on Agamben stuff next week, because I do think it's worth pursuing a bit, because I think there's some interesting stuff there. All right then. See you later, man. See you later. Okay, so yes, you had that, Will. As I say, this is a Friday. Why do I keep mentioning Monday? Because on Monday evenings, I do philosophy research night discussions on Twitch. Just on Twitch usually. They're not on YouTube most of the time. Are they now? Did I start streaming them to YouTube? I think I might have done. Anyway, they are a multiple. Basically, you can always find me on Twitch. Sometimes you can find me on YouTube and on Facebook. There we go. But you can always find me on Twitch. Twitch TV/RazorSmile. Give us a follow there. Give us a wave. Say hi. So yeah, Monday nights, 7 p.m. There's philosophy research discussions. From next Monday, the philosophy research discussions on Monday nights on Twitch will be group discussions. The seminar group from a course I recently finished on Freudian schizoanalysis. Some of the participants from the seminar course there, we're going to work together to continue some of the conversations we had, with a view to writing up some texts together, encouraging each other, working with each other, and having the conversations kind of develop towards that encounter with the written word. So that will be going on for a little while. You're welcome to follow along and join in and participate. There'll be access to chat, a bit like these kind of spaces. You can talk in the chat and we can bring it up on screen if you, and so you don't need to come online with us. You can just come and follow and chat away if you want to. So yeah, that's Monday nights, 7 p.m. group conversations around Freudian schizoanalysis. So around interest in Fanon, colonialism, anti-capitalism, schizoanalysis, which is Deleuze and Guattari, those kind of things. So that's Monday night, 7 p.m. for the next few weeks, group discussions. And on Fridays here at 10:30 in the morning, I have a chat with Eric, which is part of our project, the Freudian Spaceship. We kind of meet together once a week, talk about various bits and pieces, and that's part of our kind of touching base each week, most weeks. And so, welcome to come and have a listen, have a natter, ask us questions there. And as you heard, we'll be talking a little bit more about Agamben's book, Where Are We Now, next week, as we're working through that. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And yeah, give us a follow on Twitch if you're around. And you can always check me out if you want to get in touch. The Twitch page has links to a Discord that you can probably use. That's probably the easiest way of getting in touch. All right, see you all.